We have disabled the share screen and audio features for all the participants except our panelists. We do, however, encourage you to submit questions in the chat box. We'll spend the last 20-30 minutes of our discussion addressing your questions. So don't hesitate to start doing those as we begin. Nick Thuriot, our communications director, will help facilitate those questions. Our topic today is Putin's war of choice and the impact on Utah's energy prices. Prices have trended upwards in a big way. And as these events continue to unfold in Eastern Europe, Utahns are feeling the squeeze, both at home and at the gas pump. Today, we're joined by experts and policymakers who will discuss current price trends, how they've changed over time, and the impact on Utah households, the Utah economy. Before we introduce our panelists, I want to turn the time over to our senior energy advisor, Tom Holst at the Gardner Institute. He's going to give a top-level overview of the latest data and trends. Tom is the Gardner Institute's senior energy analyst. He's held a variety of energy-related assignments in the US and abroad, including assignments in New York City, Germany, England, Brazil, Romania, and in Russia, living in Moscow for, I think, a decade or so. So Tom, I'm going to turn the time over to you to walk us through the basics, and then we'll introduce our other panelists. I can see, Tom, that you're showing your screen and you're trying to get that mute off. I think it's going to be up the very top.
Great, thank you. I'm Tom Holst. As Natalie mentioned, I worked in the oil industry as a commodities trader during the period when Saddam Hussein invaded Kuwait, an event that raised global oil prices. I learned that energy is a global commodity, meaning that events in one hemisphere, such as the invasion of Ukraine, will affect prices in our hemisphere. The US exposure to Russian energy exports of crude is small. It's 4% of Russia's total exports, compared to Poland, which is receives 6%, Germany 10%, and the Netherlands 13%. President Biden banned energy imports from Russia, denying Russia hard currency cash flows that would aid their invasion of Ukraine. And the Biden administration invited OPEC members to ramp up crude oil production to replace Russian crude oil barrels, but OPEC refused in order to keep upright relations with Russia, an OPEC Plus member of the cartel. This graph shows cost elements corresponding to the price of motor gasoline at the pump. And at a high level, taxes account for 15%, distribution and marketing is 21%, refining is 12%, and crude oil is 53%. On taxes, federal and Utah state taxes together contribute about 50 cents per gallon to the pump price. Across the United States, state taxes range from 57 cents per gallon in California to 9 cents per gallon in Alaska. So far as distribution and marketing is concerned, distribution is the delivery of motor gasoline barrels to retail outlets. Much of Utah's population lives along the Wasatch Front. The 5 Utah refineries are located in North Salt Lake. And while I don't have Utah-specific distribution and marketing costs, I'd expect Utah costs to be in line with the national average. Refining is 12% of the cost of the pump, and North Salt Lake has 5 refineries that process roughly 200,000 barrels of crude per day. The refining capacity of Utah is larger than Wyoming, larger than Colorado, larger than New Mexico. And then finally, crude oil. 53%, we have daily information regarding crude oil prices, and West Texas Intermediate is the marker crude. This slide shows motor gasoline prices in Utah and its contiguous neighbors in the Intermountain West. Regular motor gasoline prices in Utah were $4.50 per gallon as per AAA motor gasoline price listings for each state. Using the logic from the previous slide, the Utah price is lower than Nevada and Arizona because neither of those states has refining capacity. So we'd expect that the distribution costs for those two states would be higher than Utah. Utah's regular gasoline price is lower than Nevada and Arizona, even though Utah's gasoline tax is higher than Nevada's by 8 cents and higher than Arizona's by 12 cents. This slide shows motor gasoline prices in Utah or national gasoline prices, which may cause us to feel uncomfortable if we rely only on our past memory of gasoline prices. However, we can put these prices, and those are what we would call nominal prices, which are shown in the brown line that runs along the x-axis. We can put those into perspective by inflation adjusting them. And so in the early 1980s, nominal gas prices were about $1 per gallon during the 1980 global recession. And in 2022 dollars, they were above $4 per gallon. In the 2008 Great Recession, real prices in 22 dollars were hit $5 per gallon. Another way of putting the proper context on current national motor gasoline taxes is adjusting for wages. And in this case, we've adjusted using average hourly wages in the private sector and for non-supervisory workers. The recent March motor gasoline price of $4.28 per gallon is lower than the $6 per gallon during the 2008 Great Recession. And before I move on, let me just put in context what prices in Utah or what national average prices have done over the last month. Yesterday, they were at $4.11. A week ago, $4.17 per barrel of gasoline. A month ago, $4.32, and a year ago, $2.86 per barrel. I'll focus now on crude oil, since crude oil price accounts for over half of the motor gasoline price. Utah is the 10th largest producer in the US. Much of that production comes from the Uinta Basin. A headline item is that the US produces more crude oil than Saudi Arabia and Russia. The increased production shown on the blue line comes on the back of US crude oil production technologies, such as horizontal drilling and hydraulic fracturing. And this slide shows 4 decades of crude oil prices with price spikes reacting to a revolution, a subprime mortgage crisis, and 3 hostile invasions of neighboring countries. The first hostile invasion was Iran, Iraq. The second, Iraq, Kuwait. And now the third is Russia, Ukraine. This graph shows real dollars in red and nominal dollars in black. And this graph just confirms we've been here before. So what does the future of crude oil prices look like? The United States Energy Information Administration, their short-term energy outlook projects crude oil prices at $80 per barrel in 2024. I find that price interesting for reasons that I'll detail on the next slide. I should just also call your attention that there are confidence levels, an upper and a lower bound that shows on the high side it could rise as high as $180 per barrel. On the low side, it could get down to $30 per barrel. But futures prices and the Information Administration pegged them at $80. $80 per barrel crude seems to be a watershed price pre-2020 and post-2020. The 2 graphs here display the impact of crude oil prices on mobilizing drilling rigs in the United States. Typically, higher crude oil prices attract more drilling rigs into operation. Pre-2020, on the left-hand graph, an $80 per barrel WTI price mobilized 1,100 drilling rigs in 2015. By contrast, post-2020, the graph on the right, an $80 per barrel WTI price attracted only 500 drilling rigs. 2 factors may be at play there. Energy demand destruction may be occurring when remote workers decide not to return to the office, driving down demand for motor gasoline or diesel. And the second factor may be large oil and gas companies may be reluctant to invest capital for fossil fuel projects based on signals given by the current administration. My final slide confirms that we've been seeking solutions for high motor gasoline prices over the last 5 decades. And I've listed 6 policies. The first 4 come from the era of the 1970s OPEC oil embargo. I will not elaborate on the first 3 policies other than to say that they solve one problem, but they create another. But I'll focus on the 4th policy that came out, and that was the creation of a strategic petroleum reserve that was adopted and has been used. Reserves of 714 million barrels of crude oil are a buffer for emergencies such as natural disasters, for example, hurricanes, or the Russian invasion of Ukraine. President Biden has authorized the release of 180 million barrels of reserves over a 6-month period. These extra crude oil barrels on the domestic market may tamp down crude oil prices. So with that as a preamble to the panel discussion, I will turn the word back over to Natalie.
Tom, thank you so much. Wow, that was a lot to take in and really precisely, carefully presented. So thank you for that, Tom. Tom Carter, I want to start with you. You're the Senior Energy Advisor to Utah Governor Spencer Cox. You're the Executive Director of the Utah Office of Energy Development. You oversee a staff of energy professionals. You and your team help shepherd state's energy policy. You're also a good friend and a new father to a girl named Savannah. So thanks for taking some time from your paternity leave to join us today. Love you to just react briefly to Tom's comments, his sharing of data, and then I'll introduce Steve.
Yeah, I appreciate it. It's good to be here with you. I'm a little tired, and so I'm going to blame any inconsistency of my data or remarks on a new parent brain and ask for your forgiveness in all of that. Look, Tom's data is really strong and really important. And I think that as we look at what's happening, what's driving the cost of at the pump, there are a number of factors, and he's absolutely right about this. There, as a state, we over the last month, 6 weeks, we've been having a number of high-level conversations about things that we can do, should do, and might be able to do. A few weeks ago, the governor convened a meeting with the Senate president and the speaker with a number of our production companies out in the basin and some of our refineries and a handful of his policy advisors and department heads, just to talk through some of these issues that Tom has already brought up. And we've been working on some of the data that's come out of that. I will tell you this, you know, when you think about inflation, when you think about the numbers that came out yesterday, when you think about what we're going through, there are a lot of big questions and a lot of difficult answers, as we are just a small cog in this giant international problem. Tom made a really important point. He led off with a really important point that this is a global energy crisis. And as a state, there are only a handful of levers that we can pull, if there are any, to help drive down costs. What we can do is help identify and understand what those issues are. You know, our biggest concern right now is demand destruction as it relates to what's going on with people and their usage of their vehicles. It is second winter, third winter today, but pretty soon it's going to be Memorial Day. And for the last 2 years, people have foregone a lot of travel. They have foregone a lot of car usage. I think, Natalie, when before taking this job, as you know, I was with an air quality organization, and the first 5 months of the pandemic, we saw historic levels of clean air because people were staying at home, not using their cars. And we know mobile sources are our primary cause of air quality woes here along the Wasatch Front. We also saw a huge dip in the price of a significant dip in the price of barrels because people were just not using their cars. There was just no demand for oil. Now, as we are pulling out of the recession, not recession, as the pandemic, people are looking towards the summer, as they're looking towards getting out of their houses, the school year's coming to a close. We're not seeing people alter their behavior based on the price at the pump, or we're not seeing everyone alter their behaviors. Things that we saw in the 70s, things that we saw in the late 70s and the 80s, things that we saw during the Great Recession, people making decisions based on the price at the pump. We're worried are a certain segment of the population are saying, look, I don't care how much it costs at this point. I'm willing to pay. Now that's leaving a segment of our population behind. And that's what's concerning to us, right? There are those that just can't afford the continued price increase. And because we still see an increased demand, we see a decrease in supply, that we're unsure what the ceiling is going to be on the price of motor gas here in the country, and especially along the Wasatch Front. So those are our concerns. That's where I want to start with. I'm happy to continue to have a conversation around a lot of the other issues this week.
You bring some interesting points up. Let's bring Steve Bannister into the conversation. Steve's a colleague of ours on campus. He's an associate professor of economics. He also directs the Masters of Science in International Affairs and Global Enterprise at the University of Utah. Steve, you're an expert in macroeconomics, and you have a particular specialty in the energy sector. I want to just ask you to react. We'll go into some of the more specifics, but react to what's been shared thus far. High prices, not as high when you adjust for inflation, not as high when you adjust for wages. Utah kind of in the middle of the pack in terms of prices compared to our contiguous states. What are you seeing in what Tom has shared?
Yes, thank you for the opportunity. So energy prices, gasoline prices, I think is what we're focused mostly on here. You know, when the prices go up, they certainly impact the household sector, consumers, because it's directly consumed, but it's also a cost of production for many businesses. And therefore it feeds into, you know, the CPI, the consumer price index that we saw, you know, print that 8.5% year over year, 40-year high, as all the headlines are screaming yesterday. But it also enters into the PPI, the production index, I expect. I think that's out today or tomorrow. So we'll see. So it has a huge impact, and energy inputs in general are every activity, let alone economic activity, requires energy. And a good bit of our energy inputs come from, you know, from oil-based, mainly gasoline and diesel inputs. So anytime that those prices go up, it's going to have a major impact on the economy, on households. Now, fortunately, there's some good news here that Tom Hulse began to reflect on, and I think Tom Carter brought up the concerns. Because usually when we see an inflation, it's not just a oil price, gasoline inflation. I mean, we have inflation in other sectors. They're still fairly limited in terms of the number of sectors. The dispersion isn't huge among the sectors. But food has been impacted partly because of rising gasoline, delivery, transportation costs, and because of threats to supply based on the Ukraine war. So, so my concern as a social scientist is, how does it impact especially the lower income groups in our society? Because those are the ones that normally lower income, however you want to measure it, quintiles or deciles. Those are the ones that are usually hurt when we have an inflationary event like this.
So Steve and Tom Carter, you're both kind of in some ways making the same point, that you're really concerned about households that are socioeconomically disadvantaged.
Yes.
Yeah. Let's talk for just a minute about how Utah's different. I understand that this is a global phenomenon and it's affecting every state and every country. Tom Hulse made a few points of how Utah's different, that we have significant refining capacity and whatnot. But just Tom Carter, going back to you, what makes our experience here with this particular global energy challenge, what makes it different for Utah, either producers, consumers, policymakers?
Yeah, so I mean, Tom's numbers are pretty close, right? So we according to the latest data we got from our producers, we can extract about 100,000 barrels a day in the basin. 80,000 of those come to the refineries, but he's right that we refine about 200,000 barrels a day here. And then that gets shipped all across the Intermountain West, right? So having our own.
Can I stop you there though, just just to make sure I understand that. So the Unibasin is where we have our energy focus, and 100,000 of barrels a day on average coming from there. About 80,000 of that makes it to the Salt Lake refineries.
Correct.
Which means that 20,000 is going out of state.
20,000 going out of state.
And our refineries are refining 200,000, so we're also bringing in from other places.
That's right. So feedstock, because our crude, our wax, it's wax, right? And so it needs to be, for lack of a better word, again, this is new parent brain, mixed, right? It needs to be combined with feedstock from places like Wyoming, to create the gasoline that we use and produce here. And so, but our wax is very valuable. It's about 20,000 barrels go to the Gulf Coast as well,
Yeah.
to help produce different gasoline products and petroleum products across the board, right? So think about your chapsticks,
And
your
so
petroleum jellies, all that stuff.
yeah, and so immediately a huge Utah difference is that we're an energy state.
We're an energy
Consumers get
production
hit
state.
with high prices, but we have a whole energy economy that benefits from these higher prices.
Yeah. Excuse me. Now, what we're doing though is all 5 of our refineries are producing at capacity, and you know, the way to drive down costs is to get more product on the market. But we are at capacity. We also provide fuel in our state. We have a pipeline that goes north all the way to Washington. So fuel from Utah, while it stays here in Utah, it also goes up through Idaho into Oregon and Washington. We also provide fuel down into Las Vegas. And we are constantly tracking. And again, I've been out for a week and a half. I haven't had a chance to look most recently at our rack prices, but that's kind of the price of gasoline. It's set at the rack there at the refineries. We are affected also by what happens in refining in our neighboring states. So if there's an outage on a pipeline, if there's an outage in a refinery, it causes a decrease in supply. In California or Colorado, there's only 1 or 2 operating refineries in Colorado. And so we're not an island in and of ourselves. We can't just shut down our borders and say we're going to just refine what we produce and provide it for Utah. Like there's an ecosystem that all works together, but having the ability to extract and refine does put us in a position to be successful. Yet we do rely on other states' crude to create the gasoline we need. And so that, but because, and Tom mentioned this, because of increased technologies, including the fracking and the horizontal drilling, we have been able to increase our extraction. Now, do we want to be able to increase extraction more? Absolutely we do. However, like we said, our refineries are at capacity. And so that would be able to help us just get more extracted product out to the other refineries across America. Because to Tom's point, worldwide, we are down 3 million barrels. And because we're down barrels, that's another aspect that's causing the price per barrel to go up. And we have to just find more barrels to do that. Utah, we could probably increase with some infrastructure. We could probably increase from 100,000 barrels a day to 120,000 barrels a day. And that's great, but it's not 3 million. And so we need to kind of work in that full ecosystem.
Steve, this issue has supply and demand written all over it.
It does. It does indeed. And, you know, and these are, you know, it's a complex picture, surely. And there's no question that the increased global price for oil, or in our case, West Texas Intermediate crude, is good for our oil producers in the state. Their revenues go up, you know, and the taxes the state gets from them and so forth all go up. However, I mean, it's hard to see Utah from the consumer standpoint isolated from the rest of the country, the rest of the world, because of this global price, single price of oil that is a feature of the crude oil and to some degree the gasoline market, and has been for decades. Our consumers are going to get hit by increased gasoline prices, and people, producers who use, not oil producers, all, you know, any kind of production or retail or whatever services that use energy or gasoline in their business are going to be faced with rising costs that may or may not, some portion will get passed through to consumers. There's no question about that. So there is going to, we're not isolated from the world in spite of the fact we produce quite a bit here. We can't cut ourselves off from the rest of the world. And the supply, and Tom Carter's points on supply of crude in, you know, the world supply are absolutely correct. And that's where, again, Putin's war comes in, because he's causing a lot of uncertainty in what's going to happen going forward. in the oil market, and especially if, you know, Europe ends up cutting off the imports. They haven't yet, but it's under discussion.
Yeah. Okay, we're having a lot of great questions come in, so I'm going to turn to those pretty quickly. But just to kind of set that up to both the Toms and the Steve, let's do sort of a rapid fire commentary on what some of the solutions are. Sound good?
Sure.
Okay, and you can all just jump in here. So the strategic petroleum reserves, that's been something that we knew was one of the tools we had as a country. President Biden's done that. What is it, 180 million barrels over 6 months, something like that. Tom, do you like that policy? Is it right? And then Steve, we'll let you have the final word on that one. So Carter, let's go to you first.
Yeah, look, we're great with that. You know, these are what rainy day policies are for. Will it make a difference, Tom? Carter, sorry. Will it make a difference what's the nation's done here? You know, it may. I mean, we did see after the announcement, we did see an initial dip in the price both at the pump and the price per barrel. And so it should. You know, I try and be recklessly optimistic, and so I'm hopeful that will bridge a gap. I think there are more pieces to it. We're kind of weekly. The federal government is announcing piecemeal things. It'd be nice if we just kind of said, okay, we have to do all these things from a federal government. But I think this is a good play. It's a
Tom Holston, are you in this same mindset there about the petroleum reserves being released?
Yes, I am, firmly. If I have a choice, Natalie, between going to Mr. Maduro's in Venezuela or to, let's see, a ruler in Iran or to Saudi Arabia, I'd much prefer to get my barrels from a strategic petroleum reserve than to go to an autocratic government and say, please supply us some more barrels.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Okay. And Steve, your comment on the petroleum reserve.
I think it's a great move by President Biden and the government. And I think I read, and I haven't had a chance to check it this morning, but I heard very briefly this morning that crude oil prices are back to where they were pre-Ukraine, the global price, pre-Ukraine invasion. I don't know if that's correct. If it is correct, at least some chunk of that, part of that is I think due to the release from the SPR.
The supply, yeah. Steve, let's stay with you. Go backwards here. Motor fuel taxes, super interesting. In Tom's presentation, he shared that in Utah, I believe our state is 31.9 cents per gallon, federal 18.4. A lot of talk locally about, could you do a gas tax holiday? Yep. Would that be a good solution in your part on a temporary basis, Steve? And then I'll go back to Mr. Hulse and Mr. Carter.
Yes, I think that would certainly help lower the delivered price to households. So that's an advantage to consumers. To some degree, you're borrowing from the future because those taxes are used to fund our state infrastructure, roads and bridges and so forth. So you have to figure that out. But in the short run, I think it's a really great idea.
Steve, does it not trouble you? We're going to have fun here. Two economists go back. Does it not trouble you that it would stimulate more demand?
Well, yes. However, the price elasticity, since we're talking economics, price elasticity of demand of gasoline is actually very inelastic.
Yeah,
people are in patterns, they're going to use the amount almost, and I think Tom Carter made this point, no matter what the price, and that goes both ways, whether the price goes up or goes down. There will be some increase in demand, potentially, people taking vacations and so forth, they may not have taken otherwise. But I don't think that the reduction in the percentage reduction from what we can contribute from the state, taking that tax or part of it away, I don't think that's going to be sufficient to drive demand very much.
I know, Steve, that reasonable people can disagree on this point. This has been a lot of conversation. Let's get Tom Hulse and Tom Carter comment on a temporary motor fuel tax holiday. Tom. Go, Mr. Hulse.
Yes, I would say a potential red line would be that decreasing Utah motor gasoline prices directionally spurs more travel, and that would cause more road damage, which is why those funds, those motor gasoline taxes have been instituted.
Yeah, an interesting point. Tom, we'll go to you. You'll have a lot to say on this. One of the things I find troubling about it is it's a pretty blunt tool if you're worried about socioeconomically disadvantaged Utahns, but go ahead, Mr. Carter.
Look, every time we talk about this, Carlos Braceras has a minor heart attack. And so I'd be very careful about how I talk about this. As we mentioned, you know,
Head of the Utah Department of Transportation, for those that
that's right. So like, this is a big issue. You know, by law, the money that comes through the motor gas tax goes to fund the Department of Transportation and funds our roads, funds our projects, funds the people. And so we'd have to have a hard conversation. The governor said this. He got asked this by at his April press conference if he was open to this, and he did not dismiss it, but he'd say we might have to let people go to do that. And so that's a really difficult conversation. It is a blunt instrument. The problem with tax holidays, we're seeing this from some of our other states that are doing this, is at what point do you feel comfortable putting the tax back on? It's hard to remove a tax and then increase the tax, especially when we don't know really when this demand destruction is going to be. And to Steve's point as well, because of the elasticity of the price, you know, we could remove the 30 cents tax tomorrow, and something could happen and the price could go back up 30 cents and no one could feel the savings. So I'll tell you this, it is a conversation that's being had at the highest level of the state government, if it's feasible, how to do it in a way that helps people and does not harm the state in the long term. But it is a very difficult conversation to have because of all the moving parts and how we fund transportation, how we fund our roads, but also how do we ensure that we're helping people, especially those that are hit the hardest with these inflationary aspects.
Yeah.
Could I have
Go ahead.
one additional thought? And to the points that both Toms have made on demand destruction, elevated gasoline prices are causing another current, and I think increasingly in the future, form of demand destruction for gasoline, and that's the switch to electric vehicles. So the elasticity there, I think, is actually pretty high over the medium and long term. People, when they see higher, it used to be before we had EVs, people would see higher gasoline prices, they go buy a smaller car. Now, I think it'll accelerate the already strong trend toward implementing EVs, and that should be a major thought and concern for for the gasoline tax that we're using.
Yeah, maintenance
right?
budget argument. Yeah, Steve, thanks for bringing that up. Tom, looks like you got a follow Tom Carter.
Yeah, so and that is a great point, Steve, and that goes to kind of a larger issue as well. That we have seen decreased revenues from gas tax over the last decade, right? Because cars have gotten smaller, or not just smaller, but become fuel efficiency standards have done phenomenal things because of a switch to electric vehicles. But this is a larger conversation, not just as people look to switch to electric vehicles, and but the availability of electric vehicles as well. Like the broader scale conversation around supply chain has entered into the conversation, not just around the price of energy, but also just supply chain in general. And so it is hard to purchase an electric vehicle because of issues that we're having, and energy issues as well. The minerals we need to be able to accelerate adoption of electric vehicles are tied up in places like Russia and China. And so we want to see an acceleration of electric vehicles, but this global energy economy makes life a little bit difficult at times.
Yeah. Okay. I've never seen our chat box light up like it has been with questions. I had a whole bunch more myself, but I'm going to go to our viewers, our guests today. and I'm going to try and be really direct on these so we can go through a bunch. Tom Carter, we want to be really precise in answering this question. Is all of the crude oil refined in Utah extracted in Utah? In other words, are we self-sufficient in all motor fuel usage in Utah? And if so, what is our surplus that we export? You kind of answered that, but I wanted to give it to you really directly. Are we self-sufficient?
No. So, and so we, like I said, we extract about 100,000 barrels a day. 80,000 of that goes to our refineries in North Salt Lake. 20,000 of it goes towards the Gulf Coast. We refine about 200,000 barrels a day. So we need to be able to import. Import's a weird word when you talk about from state to state, but we have feedstock from other states.
Coming from Wyoming, Tom?
Wyoming, yes.
Yeah. Okay. Very good. All right. Here's another one. Can you expand on the Strategic Petroleum Reserve? Just what is the impact on overall consumption of gasoline in the United States? How does the 1 million barrels a day compare to what we consume overall? Someone's trying to get a sense of scale of this 60 million barrels. I wonder, Tom Holst, if you could address that.
I'd be happy to. Why is it 1 million barrels a day spread out over 6 months? Well, the answer is it's logistics. When you release crude oil barrels from 4 inventories along the US Gulf Coast, you have to have sufficient pipelines. You have to have marine capacity to move those barrels to refineries within the United States. So that's the reason it is 1 million a day over 6 months. It's logistics.
Yeah, very good. Okay, anyone else want to comment on that? We're good. Okay, Steve, I don't know if you're the right one for this, but you can give us some of your thinking. But we've got someone asking about how these high motor fuel prices affect urban versus rural Utah. Is there any policy sense in providing more relief in rural Utah since they drive longer distances? Let's get your
I think I would say yes, if you can pull it off politically. I don't know how you do that. I'm certainly not an expert in the politics of all that. Tom Carter's probably closer to that than I am.
Yeah, Tom. Yeah, the question was, is the impact of rising oil prices more significant on those located in rural areas where cars are more utilized?
Yeah, I think that's a fair assessment. We've had these conversations around transit, right? If there are, UTA is not the only transit district in the state, right? There are transit districts in Uinta Basin. There's one in Logan. There are about 5 or 6, right? There's some down in St. George. I don't know all of them off the top of my head, but the ability that people have to use transit along the Wasatch Front should be an opportunity for people to get out of their car and not have to worry or rely on gasoline at this point. That not necessarily, especially for our agriculture, construction, shift workers, and especially outside the Wasatch Front, they are heavily reliant on their vehicles. So this is hitting them harder. They also drive bigger vehicles. They have to drive a truck. Their vehicles aren't as fuel efficient. They're not necessarily, and we know this because of our current electric vehicle charging infrastructure. Electric vehicles are not an option for them as well at this point, as we look over the next 3 to 5 years to build out infrastructure. Additionally, and Steve made this point earlier, it's not just our rural folks but it's also a socioeconomic issue as well. I talked about shift workers, people who can't necessarily take transit to and from their job because of when their job starts or where their job is located here along the Wasatch Front. So yes, rural is hit hardest, or harder. And then of course, those who, anybody that has to rely on their car to get anywhere is going to be hit, but rural, absolutely.
Yeah, okay, great. Steve, this is very much in the economic discipline, so I'll direct it to you. The guest says, given inelastic demand for gas and the limited number of sellers, if the state gas tax were removed, would gas prices paid by consumers even actually decline? So they're trying to get at the incidence of where that tax is paid.
Well, I think it would, because that would directly lower the pump price. Now, in order, if that wasn't, if somehow the producers
If it's
chose,
marked at the rack, it might not lower the pump price.
well, right. So if the producers or distributors chose to say, well, the consumers just got the 30% or 30-cent gallon bonus, we'll take it all back by raising our prices. And most of that would go to their profits probably at that point.
I think that's the concern. Yeah, I think that's the concern.
Right. And so I think Tom Carter and the government would probably sort of look at that with sort of a, shaking their head a little bit, and there would be some pressure from the somewhere in the political system to not allow all that to happen.
Yeah, maybe part of the reason it hasn't happened. Tom, we've got a question directly to you. You mentioned that you'd had a meeting with the Uinta Basin oil producers. Was there anything from that meeting that could impact local prices? Did you learn something you can share?
So we learned a lot. I mean, I'll just say a lot of ideas have been passed a lot. What from the basin, a lot of conversations around infrastructure and workforce. There's a desire for them to extract more. There's a desire for them to get more barrels out. But there's a need for infrastructure there. There's a need for workforce there, I think. But infrastructure and workforce are not unique to extraction. They are a global issue, and and we're seeing this, Natalie. You see this every day as you work on workforce issues around the state of Utah. We've got issues of we need diesel in the basin to be able to get crude out of the basin. We need truck drivers. We need all these kind of people that we just have not seen an increase or a return to the numbers of the pre-pandemic numbers. And so there are just so many pieces to solving a problem with this. And we see this, right? We have companies come in, they meet with us, they meet with the governor. They're like, we're excited. We want to bring 20,000 jobs to Utah. And we're like, great. But we're having a hard time filling the positions that we have. We basically have. And so
to all of the panelists, this is super interesting, right? Because we can talk about all these ideas to address high motor fuel prices, but if we can't get the workers to deliver on the supply, it doesn't matter.
Yeah, and Steve made this point really well earlier. It's really hard. The basin, you see it. We've all been out there. The boom and bust nature of the basin makes it really hard for companies to invest capital. It makes it hard for workers to stay or go. Like if I can move to New Mexico or Texas, where I know that my job will be more consistent instead of kind of fluctuate the way it does. Of course, all oil and gas jobs fluctuate, but the fluctuation of the price, and we've seen this really in the last 2 years. I mean, the price per barrel 2 years ago was like negative $40, and no one was doing anything. And so we just saw just an exodus of people out of the basin. They went to go find where they could make money, where they could live. And now we're like, come back. Please work for us. And so it's just, everything boils down to a people problem at some point.
Tom Hulse, give us a sense compared to other states, how big of an oil producer we are in Utah. How many states are oil producing states, and where are we?
Yeah, we're number 10 so far as production is concerned. As we've mentioned before, the type of crude oil that's produced limits probably our production. And so what I would say is, where do we compete? That is, it's a good problem to have when companies want to come in and produce in Utah, but who do we compete with? We compete with North Dakota. We compete with the Permian Basin, which straddles New Mexico and Texas. And so those are very, very stiff competitors.
Yeah.
Would I like to have Utah attract more workers? Yes. What will we have to do? I'll leave that thorny question to our legislative leaders.
Yeah. So thanks, Nick, for popping up this graphic. I think it's super interesting, Tom, given your commentary as well, Tom Carter, because you know, you see that it's only the states that are shown there that are oil producing states. And, you know, we're small relative to some of the other states, but look at Texas, look at North Dakota, look at New Mexico. And if you're looking for oil and gas jobs, those might be places that you might want to be. Okay, very helpful. So another question I just don't want to finish up without bringing up, and Tom Carter, I think you're the best one to help us with this, but I'd love others to comment on it. We need to talk about federal lands. The issue is 2/3 of our land owned by the federal government. And turns out that that's where most of the oil and gas reserves are. President Biden put a hold on new permitting. Am I getting that right, Tom Carter?
Yep.
So I guess the question is, yet we also have a lot of permits that aren't being acted on.
Yep.
But is the federal land issue part of the short-term solution, or is it more just a medium to long-term play for our state?
So I'd like to say it's a little bit of both. And this goes back to the fact, and Tom and Steve have both made this point, that because this is a globally traded commodity, that the message, there has to be a message sent to the commodity traders, to the New York Mercantile Exchange, that we're trying to find a way to stabilize the market. And so the president, when he banned Russian imports, sent a strong message. Didn't stabilize the market, but it sent a strong message. Yesterday, when the president talked about the E15 as it relates to ethanol, sent a stabilizing message as it relates to we're not going to switch to summer blends. So that should help. With some of the price issues on summer blend. But there's another tool in his tool shed or tool belt, if you will, to send a stabilizing message to the market, and that's to lift this ban on new leases. Yes, there are leases that have not been acted on, but there is a whole newsmaker breakfast on that, on what that means and how that goes and what it takes to even act on a lease. I won't go into that into detail, but what we've seen is that even though the courts have told the Biden administration that they need to start issuing leases, they haven't. And there is a lot of federal land. There's a lot of good commodities that can be taken. It would send, I believe, and we believe as a government, that it would send a message that we are open to increasing extraction in America that could then send a message to the exchanges that, okay, we'll be able to find, at least in the long term, that we're going to stabilize. This is also an issue from the electric vehicle standpoint.
Exactly.
The minerals that I talked about in relation to Russia and Ukraine and China, they're available here in the States, but they are tied up on federal lands as well. And so we almost have a federal administration that's talking out of both sides of its mouth. We want more electric vehicles. We want you guys to be energy independent. They don't necessarily say energy independent, but we've got a Department of Energy that says we need to have more transmission, more electric vehicles, more minerals, all those things. And we have a Department of Interior that says, but you can't get them out of our lands, which is just very, very difficult for us to say, well, you're talking out of both sides. You won't let us go and do these things. And from a state like Utah, where we know we have this ability to go do it, it makes it really difficult for us to be successful, or to make us feel like they want us to be successful. And the key is to send the message to the market from a relationship to gasoline prices, or not gasoline prices necessarily, but the price per barrel, that we're going to find a way to stabilize. Anyway, I could talk for an hour on that. I'm going to try and cut myself off.
Those are really good points. Steve?
Yeah, I have a bit of a nuanced view on what Tom says. Those are very strong points. There's no question about that. Our current administration is sort of, they're in a bit of a quandary over the balancing the drive toward electrification of transport, which is clearly a goal, and also, at least in the short term, trying to increase oil production, therefore gasoline, to try to influence the lower price on the global market. And they've been successful in the short run in doing that with the SPR and the ethanol announcement. But freeing up leases is not a short-term it doesn't increase supply immediately. I think it's a very complex supply chain. So if the Ukraine war were over in 2 weeks, say, I don't think that's going to happen. Some people think it may, but within a reasonable time frame, then those pressures are starting to go away pretty quickly, maybe before the new supply that opening up leases would free up. So, there's all kinds of complex timing going on here that make that, I think, questionable for at least the medium term, in my opinion.
Yeah, Steve, that's interesting. Tom, I see you have your hand up and want to hear your comments on this.
Yeah.
Holst.
I'd like to say that there is an opportunity, an energy opportunity here for the United States, and it relates to liquefied natural gas. As you know, the Nord Stream 2 pipeline has been shut down by the German government. And so the German economy will need natural gas. And the United States switched from being an importer of liquefied natural gas to being an exporter of liquefied natural gas 10 years ago. And I think we're in the position, we have natural gas reserves that would allow us to take advantage of that opportunity to be a supplier of natural gas, which is a lower carbon fuel, to a valued NATO and EU member.
Yeah, thanks, Tom. Great making that point. We are down almost to the bewitching hour, got about 2.5 minutes left in our Newsmaker. I'm going to ask each of you to give some advice. We've got Memorial Day weekend on the horizon. We've got the Strategic Oil Reserve being released. We've got new ethanol standards planned for the summer to help with this. The president's banned Russian imports. We've got all sorts of policy discussions happening in state government. So to each of you, let's give some advice to Governor Cox, and Tom Carter, we'll give you the last word since your advice is the one that really hits home. But let's start with Tom Holst. Give advice to Governor Cox for how he relieves the pressure here for Utah consumers, and then we'll go to Steve and then to Tom. So yeah. Tom Holst.
Yeah, I like our options in our current decade. We, as is mentioned, we have the ability to switch to a vehicle, either an electric vehicle or a hydrogen fuel cell vehicle. We also have the opportunity to take the lead from Utah state government. We can work from home, cut down on driving mileage. But then more importantly, we can take the front runner or the tracks. And I don't think we could have said that 40 years ago. So those are good opportunities that we can leverage to help us through the transition.
Thanks, Tom Holst. Steve Bannister.
I'd like to see the governor support temporary removal of the state portion of the gasoline tax. I think that would be an immediate help to consumers, lower the cost of the pump without driving up demand very much, if at all. In the longer term, I would love to see increased support from the state in many possible ways, and they're already doing a lot of this, toward the transition. It's an inevitable transition, even with the supply side, to electric vehicles. This is an opportunity to really, accelerate that. And we're going to have to make the change sooner or later. I think getting an early start is a very wise thing to do for this state as well as the rest of the world, frankly.
Yeah, Steve, that's a really strong point. Inevitable transition, get a head start on it.
Yep.
We're going to give you the final word.
Yeah, look, I think all those are really great advice. I will tell you, Steve, we absolutely agree. You're going to see $80 to $85 million investment in EV infrastructure, both from the utilities, from the feds, and the state. Our position on EV is that infrastructure has to come first, and you're going to see it. Of the state, the legislature passed on additional money related to rural infrastructure as well, because as I mentioned earlier, it's just we have to cover every nook and cranny of the state. Look, from my perspective, and we want to make sure that every option is on the table, and in the meetings that we've been having with the governor, every option is on the table. I do think that it's important, and to echo something that Tom Holst said, that from a state government perspective, the ability that we've had to adapt to work from home, encourage people to take transit, has been great. We do want to find opportunities, as I mentioned, that it's just not about UTA. We want to be able to engage with our other transit partners throughout the state to find solutions for people. One of the things that we've seen in data that I collected in my previous life that showed that cost has not necessarily been a driver to keep people off transit, or that's kept people off transit, but now maybe this is a tipping point for people. And so we can maybe do some things to encourage people to get on transit. I'll just say, stay tuned. The governor, this is a partnership. It always has been between the executive branch and the legislative branch. And so any advice to the governor has to be advice to the legislature as well. And so we're working hard with our legislative partnerships to come up with solutions.
Thank you, Tom. This concludes our Newsmaker Breakfast. Special thank you to Tom, and Steve for all of their insights. Our next breakfast will be May 11th at 8:30 a.m. Stay tuned for the details. If you have any questions, comments, or feedback, please write us at gardnerinstitute@eccles.utah.edu. Thanks so much, everyone. Take good care.
Thank you.